Man like Mark Sullivan, worry yourself. Stay tuned for the thrilling episode. Woo!
A positive mental attitude can clear away all obstacles which stand between you and your major purpose in life.
This is the Snowboard Project featuring Mark Sullivan and the Bead. The Snowboard Project. The Snowboard Project. The Snowboard Project.
Welcome back to the Snowboard Project. I'm Mark Sullivan.
And I am the Beav, and we are coming at you from the Snowboard Project studios in beautiful Sun Valley, Idaho. About to open our mountain this next week, which is rad.
Yeah, so, getting ready to shred. I'm all waxed up.
You stoked to shred?
Yeah.
Me too.
I'm all waxed up, mounted up.
Are you really?
Got my boots by the door.
Oh, man. Yes.
Yes, it's coming.
All right, well, who do we have in the hopper today?
Okay, Dave Schreiber is a guy who works for Nike. Or actually, he used to work for Nike, but he was there for about 14 years. And he went on to being like the global brand marketing director. He had thousands of employees. He was like one of the top marketing guys for all of Nike.
Sounds pretty important. Why? I get that we do industry insiders on this podcast, but why Dave Schreiber?
He's the guy who pulled the plug on snowboarding for Nike. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding,
dude. Let's just pull that up. Okay, so why? Tell me a little bit more.
No. So Dave Schreiber actually got his start at Burton Snowboards.
Okay,
so that's how actually I know Dave is from his time at Burton. He was the vice president or president of marketing for Burton Snowboards.
Okay,
and he was the guy who kind of oversaw the brand marketing that was during the largest growth time for Burton. Like as snowboarding was exploding, he was the head of marketing for Burton.
Like late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, late 90s, early 2000s, he was the head of marketing for Burton. And so he kind of established a lot of the programs that are still in place to this day.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think he was one of the most important marketing people ever for Burton.
Right. So we are looking at kind of his story through the years at Burton, working his way to one of the top positions over at Nike, which
I would say one of the most important sports marketing jobs in the world.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's roll into it. Dave Schreiber.
Yeah, Dave Schreiber. Okay, so today I am joined by Dave Schreiber.
How's it going?
Yeah, pretty good, Dave. I've known you a long time. I know you better from the world of snowboarding, and you were, I know you when you were I met you when you were the marketing director. I don't know, there's probably a fancier title, like vice president of market. What was your title there?
Well, at some point I was the VP of marketing, and I think at some point you were our chief critic.
I may still be. I'm the chief critic of snowboarding to this day, right? And so it's like, I just want people to have integrity, have the same integrity I have in the sport, right? And so I always put the sport first. I've sacrificed a lot for snowboarding, and so I think that the brands should, or at least the biggest ones, should kind of have some of that same value. Of course, they got to make money and they got to do their thing, but yeah, I've always been critical of Burton, but not just Burton.
No, I think you and Pat Bridges were the conscience of snowboarding for that era.
Yeah, that's maybe still. I don't know. Bridges is still kind of, I don't know. It's interesting. Snowboarding media has changed.
It has.
Significantly. So how did you get started? Like, did you go to I'm sure you went to college somewhere. You must have gotten an education to become
I went to UMass Amherst. I studied English and computer science.
Okay.
And it took me 10 years to get my degree. And to fund that 10-year college habit, I had a skateboard shop.
Okay.
And to sort of get to the point where it actually made money, I added snowboarding to sort of the portfolio of the shop. And I used to do skateboard camps. And that got me into a conversation with Burton Snowboards that was basically right up the road from where I was in Western Mass. So when I finally did graduate and I couldn't take it working in retail anymore, I hit up the folks at Burton and said, is there anything I could possibly do for a job with you guys? And
they said, we're looking for a boot stuffer.
Pretty much. I think it was Jake who was like, I think you should probably work in marketing. Talk to Dennis Jensen.
Okay.
Whom I hadn't met until I went up there for my first interview. And DJ and I totally hit it off. And at that moment, Tim Pogue was just starting at Burton as well. And suddenly it was the three of us at the helm of where does this brand go next? What does it look like? What does it have to say?
What year was that?
1992.
Right. So that was right when the sport was like growing exponentially every year. Things were kind of changing for you guys. I'm sure you had to keep hiring people to join your marketing department.
I was employee number 150.
Uh-huh.
And I think when I left Burton, it was probably 600 or 700 employees,
right?
And probably thousands of employees later in terms of turnover,
right?
And when I started at Burton, it was a handful of $1 million company, and I think when I left, it was probably knocking on $1 billion.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's crazy to know how the sport grew through that time, and Burton really was riding that wave more so than anyone. So, what was like a typical day like at Burton when you first started?
Well, first, you'd roll in and probably pet all the dogs. Burton was very dog friendly, so it was a pretty awesome atmosphere to walk into. And I would also get there super early, and our offices were the snowboard factory, and the snowboard factory was our offices. So I would be walking in with the first shift in the morning of folks who were out there to actually make the snowboards with their lunch boxes and stuff. So you sort of really were in the middle of the craft of making snowboards and in the culture of Vermont and dogs and skipping work for snow days. So it was a really interesting environment to step into. And it was also very remote from surf and skate culture of Southern California. So it was very much in its own world. And what we knew of the sport and the generation that was driving it came to us entirely through the pro snowboarders that we worked with. So, a day in the office would be largely trying to pick up on the intelligence of what the people who do snowboarding every day for a living
do you think
had to share.
Do you think that like being that far removed from surfing and skateboarding, that allowed you to create kind of a different, unique identity for the sport of snowboarding? Because obviously you guys were the most present, the biggest brand, and so you were able to kind of steer almost the culture of snowboarding.
Hell yeah. Point. And I think, in those first years when I was at Burton, we were unwittingly caught up in a West Coast trend called grunge, I guess. But for us, it was just dressing like a Vermonter. So wearing wool plaid and
all of a sudden you were cool.
Brown pants, and suddenly, everybody's like, where'd you get that jacket? So, sometimes unknowingly we were sort of, riding a wave. And I think other times we were sort of making the wave because, I think with great respect to surf and skateboard culture, they are their own cultures, and snowboarding really was in the midst of developing one. And I think it helped to have companies like Burton and athletes who were based all around the world sort of contributing to a new point of view on, say, board sports. And, we would go to the trade shows like Action Sports Retailer and sometimes be like, what are we doing here? Like, we're not a skateboard company. None of us can surf for shit. Like we're a bunch of snowboarders or people serving snowboarders. Maybe we need to sort of have our own scene. And I think the other thing about being in Vermont, we weren't in a city, so we weren't really, as individuals, distracted by what might be going on in that city. We sort of had to make.
So were you
Vermont
in London area? Were you in Southern Vermont at that point?
I started 2 days before Burton moved to Burlington.
Okay.
So for the small group of people who were they were in Manchester at the time, it was a really big cultural shift to go to Burlington.
That was a big city for Vermonters.
Yeah. And I think even Jake was, and Jake grew up around New York, was a little skittish that by bringing that company closer to even a city the size of Burlington, that it might lose its identity, or we would just stop hanging out with each other anyway. But I think when we got to Burlington, it was still a small enough town and a college town that we as a group sort of stood out and were different enough to sort of hang together and want to be a community within a bigger community of Burlington.
Right.
But it also just gave us access to an airport and to musicians who were traveling through town, and just some of the things that were really hard to get down in Manchester. Yeah,
there wasn't a lot. Well, you'd have to drive to Albany, right? That was the closest airport.
Brutal.
Yeah, and then a couple hour drive through back roads, right? And there are no real music venues or even enough population to bring in culture so much. So,
only if we brought it in ourselves,
right?
For Jake's Bash or for the U.S. Open.
Right. So did any people have like a difficulty making that transition to the bright lights and big city of Burlington?
There were a few people who chose to stay in Manchester, and there were a couple of people who commuted from southern Vermont to Burlington every day.
Wow.
In fact, one of the guys that was a manager on the snowboard production side, Tom Cagney, he was also my partner in crime in building all the trade show booths because he was a carpenter. But he would drive 2 hours to work in the morning.
That's just a long commute, especially for Vermont.
Yeah, but he was able to sort of keep his house and his lifestyle in southern Vermont, but stay with the company for quite a while.
Right.
And, what was really great about working for a global company and living in Vermont was we all got to travel to some pretty cool places. So Vermont was always a great place to come home to. And even if you had a longer commute, because I was commuting from Stowe for a lot of that time, which is about, an hour's drive. I didn't mind it so much because 90 days of the year I wasn't commuting. I was someplace else chasing snow.
Right. It's not like it's stop and go traffic all the way to work every day. It's not like commuting in Southern California.
We called it the Vermont Autobahn. We would just, get on, turn on the radar detector and single file line in the fast lane all the way into town. Yeah.
Interesting. So, you were there, you started out like probably at the bottom of the totem pole, but really the totem pole wasn't very big then.
No.
So the totem pole grew pretty rapidly. And would you say that like Dennis Jensen back then was your mentor? Did he kind of show you the ropes?
Absolutely. He and I are the same age, but he's at least 10 years more mature than I am. And he had a really strong financial business background going into his role at Burton. He hadn't spent 10 years dawdling around in college like I had. So he was a great mentor, both as somebody who was my buddy and understood what it was like to try to figure out how to work in a high growth company. But also a mentor who knew a lot of things that I didn't about business and finance and marketing that he could teach me. So I think, for 4 or 5 years there, I was a student of Dennis Jensen as much as I was a student of Jake Burton.
Yeah, I remember people definitely, even as a Grom, I was probably 16 or 17 in the early 90s. That's when I was graduating. I was a little older. I was graduating high school though, like in 91 I graduated. But people held Dennis Jensen in the highest regard, on the streets. And it's he wasn't his name didn't appear in catalogs or ads or whatever, but yet everyone kind of knew there was this guy kind of behind the scenes pulling the puppet strings, so to speak.
Well, I think at one point, Trans World Business called him the most powerful man in snowboarding.
Yeah. And
that was when he was the VP of marketing. And then when I succeeded him in that role, he was like, congratulations, you're now the most powerful man in snowboarding. I'm like, no, Dennis, no matter where you go, you will continue to carry that mantle.
So where did he go after Burton? Where do you go when you're at this company? I mean, well, first of all, why do you leave? And then where do you go? Because Dennis must have left. He left at a certain point vacating the spot for you. But that's got to be hard when it's doubling every 2 or 3 years in size.
I think DJ was very hungry for more experience in business and really high growth business. And I think for the 90s, Burton gave that to him. And sort of towards the end of his tenure at Burton, he was the person who launched Gravis and Anon and Analog. And I think he was seeking to make Burton more of a year-round, multi-seasonal brand and keep that high pace of growth. I don't think Jake was as into the growth maybe as DJ was, and so DJ started to look elsewhere. And DJ's now in investments and venture capital and wheeling and dealing in a really cool space. So you could sort of see the entrepreneurship that he brought to Burton is something that he keeps bringing to every problem in business that he tackles.
Interesting. I can only imagine how successful he is today based on how successful he was at Burton and growing Burton really with exponentially. And by the way, keeping it at, a leader in terms of market share for, still to this day, I'd say that Burton's legacy is based on what you and DJ did for that brand. And it's kind of, the train left the station with you guys and it's still going down the tracks.
Well, I think that's, when you talk about Burton after sort of the era when I was there, that's maybe the thing that I'm most proud of today is that whatever DJ or what I brought to Burton was meaningful enough and enduring enough that it's still, I think, happening in this moment. I still have conversations with people about, components of the identity of Burton, even the logo that came out of that time that are still very important to the brand and still part of the energy of the brand. And to know that what we did then still matters is pretty rewarding.
Right. And are there a lot of people from that era still that you work? Are there people that you work directly with still at Burton aside from like Jake and Donna?
The folks that are still there, like Greg Dockashin or John Lacey, I'll run into them from time to time. But I think part of leaving Burton and sort of not feeling too homesick about it was to sort of try to step away and go be a consumer of the brand and not try to be an insider so much.
Did you buy all Burton gear from then on?
I still, well, first of all, when I left Burton, sort of the gold watch at Burton was to sit down with Jake and be like, yo, can I just get free gear for life? So we did a little contract where I get a setup every year.
Nice.
And then,
what's your current board, by the way?
I have a custom X. I haven't gone in this year to take a look at what the line looks like, but it's that time.
Kind of aside, right? But it's interesting because they have so many options.
Oh, man. I remember when I was writing catalog copy and, DJ was trying to give me some advice about maybe anticipating what consumers might be confused by. And he's like, hey, one of the things you got to do is you got to find a way to explain to people why we need to offer 12 different boards.
12. Right now it's like 100.
Yeah, I think everybody's lost count.
Yeah. And like all the different price points. And then in every price point, there's something for a different riding style.
Well, that's the thing. I think the sport is always progressing and riders are always looking for new terrain and new takes on that terrain. And, even the split board line is probably in itself bigger than the entire Burton snowboard line was in 92.
Is that a good thing though? Because it seems like, you were a shop guy, right?
Yeah.
You remember, you can kind of channel that. It's like, there's only so many boards you can carry at a shop. And once you get to 150 boards, it's like maybe Backcountry, Evo, maybe just a handful of shops worldwide can carry the width and breadth of the line. And then, of course, you probably have, now you have flagship stores in metropolitan areas and Vermont.
Well, I think you're hitting the nail on the head for the challenge that both brands have and consumers have now, especially where you've got something like snowboarding where people really want to specialize. And it is impossible for a physical store to carry everything. And, you know, brands like Burton have gone forward with selling directly to consumers online or building those flagship stores to give people access to everything in the line, even if it's only for a few weeks at the end of the summer, that everything is in stock, but you have your shot. And I think that's a problem that everybody's trying to work through in a lot of industries of how do you deal as a brand both directly with consumers as well as keep shops and shop culture alive. And
I mean, that's shop culture. It is. I mean, that's why
culture.
I'm a snowboarder today, is because after high school, I would go to a snowboard shop and hang out and then travel on the weekends with those friends that I made there. And that's where the culture, the rubber hit the road for the culture of snowboarding for me. And so it's like, I know lots of people who didn't do that, didn't have that experience, but they also don't really snowboard today, you know?
Well, it was a great experience advantage I felt that I had when I was at Burton, was having spent so much time standing behind the counter in a shop and being cool with kids hanging out in the store all day. You know, my shop hours reflected school hours. The kids got out of school at 3, I opened at 3. And, you know, I had videos playing the whole time and kids could just hang out all day long. And I think, you know, in a chain store, people might be more uptight about that and be like, I don't want a bunch of teenagers hanging out here. And
no sofa with a TV sitting there. And
why don't encourage kids to hang out here? But for me, it was one incredible learning experience to have kids walk in every day and tell me what's up, because they knew way better than I did. But two, to see how their time spent in the shop or even in my skate camps was time well spent for them, because they weren't bored and they weren't off getting into trouble, and they were having, you know, some really interesting conversations about what's going on in the world. And I feel like that shop culture pre-social media was a really healthy way for kids to connect with each other. Yeah.
I think that, I mean, we got into trouble, but not any more trouble than anyone else. It's not like we started like a steal, like a gang of thieves that would, go like, that's not what happened at the shop. We were scheming to go snowboarding.
Yeah, exactly. It was really, I think, the culture of self-selecting who's going to hang out at a shop, but the kids who were there because they really love the sport and wanted to talk about it, wanted to share it, wanted to see it on video, wanted to look at the gear, wanted to have an opinion about it, and wanted somebody to listen to that opinion.
So where can kids do that? How do kids connect with that level of culture today?
Well, I think the brands who are really good at it are brands that do understand that social media is a two-way conversation. And I think that, what we used to have going at Burton was the rider service hotline. We used to call it the fishbowl. It was this glass room in the middle of the offices that, we'd have 6 or 8 people who were pretty much entry level to the company looking for their shot. But for the time being, they were answering phones and talking to snowboarders and hearing what they had to say.
There must have been some good feedback though, right?
Oh man, it was amazing, and the people that worked in that call center, there was Pete Banta, was one of the greats who led that team. And, you just walk in there and be like, all right, so what's happening on the phones today? And he'd be like, oh man, let me tell you, like the magazines just hit, or this video just came out, and this is what people are saying. And I would be like, this is amazing information.
Right.
Did
you ever sit down and like pick up the
Oh, totally. Yeah. I would sit in. We would also have riders sit in. I mean, I sat next to Terrier when he answered a few calls, and kids would be like, "What? No, this isn't Terrier Hawkinson." And I'd be like, "Does anybody else have this accent that you can imagine?" No, it's Terrier Hawkinson.
Nice.
But I think that two-way street conversation that goes on in a skate shop when it can happen directly with a company, and if a digital channel is the way that it happens, that's totally cool. It's still the people who ride all the time having the opportunity to tell people who don't ride as much what's up.
Right. I guess that's kind of true, because there's groups like Dig My Quiver, where it's like this group of like guys who are like, they've actually become friends in the real world, right? They kind of poke around at first to see if this is their spot, and then they find this common ground with the other people in that group, and they end up becoming friends.
Totally. And I think one of the great things that was happening in snowboarding was you had to chase snow, and riders were coming from everywhere, and it was a very global sport immediately. It begged for the opportunity to communicate more freely and globally than it could maybe at the time. Mm-hmm. So when we could start connecting digitally, it just opened the floodgates. People really wanted to befriend like-minded riders on the other side of the world that just didn't have a way yet.
Yeah.
And then digital media comes along, and we were a part of that. I think it helped at Burton for me was to be a computer science nerd when I started working there.
We're going to make this all in C+.
Well, yeah, but even going to get their domain name registered, because I still joke today, it would be Burton Snowboards 1977.com if I hadn't been there in 92 and explained to everybody, if we don't lock this down today, it's going to belong to someone else forever.
Yeah.
So we had the domain probably 2 years before we had a website up. Little known fact, Burton Snowboards won the first Clio award ever for digital media. For the website, we did it with this agency called Resource Marketing. Dan Schust was one of the guys on the team. And, we were trying to be cutting edge with what was possible online with what limited bandwidth there was. But we're also trying to be, honest to the sport and real, knowing that there's the Bridges and Sullivan show out there somewhere who's going to look at this stuff and be like, is this authentic to snowboarding? Is what you're writing online something that we'll have to respond to online? Like, we were immediately aware that we would have a digital audience that would have something digitally to say back to us. So we worked really hard, and had a lot of people behind the scenes looking at sites or pages that were in development, and I think that approach was part of why it got recognized pretty early as innovative marketing, because I think if you were a panelist trying to decide who's winning the Clio award, you'd look at the snowboarding site and be like, well, I don't understand any of it, but it clearly is speaking some language to somebody in a really clever way. You can still go on the Wayback Machine on the internet and see a couple of the pages got saved, and they're so bad. Like, when you look at them today,
because they're like HTML programs.
You realize how limited we were.
Yeah.
In terms of what we could do. But there was even, I think within a year of launching, we had little videos and animations, and I think that was part of it too.
Animated GIFs.
Yeah, but
sequences.
But that was a big deal. I mean, skate and snow, surf, when it was the magazines getting sequences, and then we did seamless sequences with Photoshop, was a really important way of learning how tricks were done.
Yeah.
And video is important to understanding and communicating how tricks were done, and then having the opportunity then to put it online. I mean, that was game changing for everyone. You used to have to wait for the magazine or wait for the video, and now you could just get on a computer.
It seems like your job got a lot more complicated over the years. It's like, okay, you have 2 magazines, and then all of a sudden you went from 2 videos to like 30 videos that you could potentially sponsor. Now there was no online. Now they're like, online's really important and gaining, importance as time goes on. You have trade shows, sales reps, POP. You got to have some kind of presence in the shops. There's a lot of aspects to marketing, and it seems like as the company was growing exponentially, not only did the output of marketing materials have to grow exponentially, but the avenues of of marketing materials were growing, maybe not exponentially, but they were growing lockstep. How did you guys keep up with being at the cutting edge, at the forefront of marketing, and having like everything kind of expanding?
Well, I think because a lot of those things happen in real time for us, we had a chance to sort of grow into it. I think with having the internet as a communication tool, but with its limitations, it gave us a couple of years to begin to get our heads around what we could do with it before people expected it to do things. Right. And, you know, the team grew, we got more mature, we continued to learn to listen better. But I think maybe the most important thing, you know, over that decade, really the thing that I learned about marketing in that time was the power of really understanding who you are as a brand and being super consistent and faithful to that. Mm-hmm. It's not like the day that I started at Burton in 92, there was this little manual that said, this is the brand and what we stand for. And this is what we should look like and sound like. We knew that maybe intuitively, but probably 4 or 5 years into it, we started to realize that is something you have to document. And that is something that you have to sort of indoctrinate people into when they start with the company. So they kind of know where we're coming from. And then if
so
they
there's
really
a brand
get it,
boot camp where you
yes,
they shave your head with a bee on the back. And
I've done brand boot camps for like 20 years now, pretty much since it dawned on me at Burton that, you know, that we all had different versions or pieces to the truth.
Right.
But if we would just talk to each other once a year, we could sort of put that composite together and be critical of it and land it in a way that everybody who had a project to do or who was going to represent the brand, like say a sales rep in a shop, they knew who we were, and they knew sort of what we stood for. And
yeah, there was consistency from the guy who answers the phone all the way to Jake, and probably it would trickle down from Jake, but it was like every person who touched Burton kind of had or developed, with your help, the same idea of what Burton meant.
Yes.
And what it meant as a brand and what it meant for riding and the quality of the product design, everything fell under this umbrella of Burton as a brand.
And Jake was an incredible partner in crime in all those tasks because he, I think, was kind of a writer at heart, probably still is a writer at heart, and really paid attention to how he worded things, how he depicted things, was constantly advocating for the rider's point of view. So I think you had the ultimate sounding board internally with Jake. If the brand position didn't line up to sort of Jake's values for the company, then you needed to go back and work on it a little bit more.
How often would you work directly with Jake on?
I had such, for me, Jake was my idol in 92 when I started there. And I had such incredible access to him from pretty much day one. Mm-hmm. His office was directly across the hall from my desk, and he sat like on a couch at a coffee table. That was basically his office setup. And he could look out his doorway and see my back. Mm-hmm. So anytime I owed him something or he owed me something because we were working on some copy together or whatever, we would just yell across the hall, which is pretty much every day.
Really?
And so it really gave me a chance to understand what he was trying to do. Mm-hmm. But also maybe learn from some of his mistakes and try to apply them myself before I actually made them. Right. You know, I there's a story that I don't feel gets told enough about how when Craig Kelly was first starting to work with Burton, and Craig was the one who was pushing for a more twin tip freestyle shape. Mm-hmm. And I think the way I was told the story, the snowboard design establishment at Burton was like, well, we've already tried that. Like, that doesn't really work for riders.
They just X that off and moved on.
And Craig was like, well, yeah, but aren't I the world champion? And aren't you talking to me because you want me to come work with you guys? So shouldn't you really be listening to me? And Jake was like, you're right. We'll listen to you. And Jake was the first to admit, he was like, I was resisting rider feedback, and it took Craig to make us understand that the riders would always know better. Like they do it every day. If we're so great at snowboarding, what are we doing behind a desk?
Right.
And so that was a lesson that was drilled into me from the beginning. And even down to writing catalog copy, making sure that I was running it by athletes, riders, who would take the time and maybe make some notes for me, so that I wasn't saying something that misrepresented who they were or what the brand was, or just was technically not accurate.
That's pretty interesting. I think that, the world of snowboarding, like pretty much once that happened, once that first Craig Kelly, the pizza board anyway, the one that actually had his signature on it.
The accident at the fast food restaurant.
Yeah. Well, but that was a very memorable board, one that still is like around to this day.
Hey, what's up, guys? This is Beeve. I'm sitting here with Sully in a room just talking about snowboarding. If you can believe it, we're just a couple guys with a couple microphones. The idea really was to make a podcast for the people by a couple snowboarders, and that's us. But in turn, we need you to help us out. Go to patreon.com/the Snowboard Project, and just for like a couple bucks, maybe the cost of a beer, you can help us keep creating these shows. This month, we have so much good content for you. We have Torgeir, we have Nate Holland, we have Dave Schreiber, Kurt Heine. We have all these people in the industry, and these are interviews for you so that you can go listen to them and learn something about the industry that you are directly a part of. We want to keep creating them for you. So if you can help us out, 1, share our podcast. 2, potentially donate to our podcast. 3, rate our podcast. And 4, keep listening to our podcast, because the more of those things that we get, the more we can keep creating, the more cool ideas we can start tackling, and the more great stories we can keep bringing to you. So thank you for listening, and thank you for being a part of that. Patreon.com/the Snowboard Project.
Back then, also, along with Craig Kelly, there was like Jean Nerva and Peter Bauer. Are you the guy that's responsible for killing racing in North America? Because I know that there was like a long history of racing that started at Burton, but then it kind of ended at a certain point in time.
I was certainly at the table when the discussion was what truly is the future of racing and snowboarding. I was definitely not the person who tried to kill it. And as you will bear witness, I've tried to resurrect it by riding vintage boards.
Yes, okay.
Terribly at that, but I tried digging out the Safari 210 prototype model from the archives.
Yeah.
I was a big fan of alpine snowboarding. I had a hard boot setup for quite a while myself, but as a company trying to make a business out of that, it was really tough. Back to the point you made earlier about shops trying to stock boards.
Right, it's like 2 sports. It's like a whole line of hard boots, a whole line of soft boots.
What are you going to bet your inventory dollars on this year? Your open to buy is going to go to something that you know for sure someone's going to come in and ask for. But racing taught us a lot about how to make better boards. It gave us something else really great to talk about. It brought great athletes and personalities into the conversation that wouldn't otherwise be there.
What was that final decision that like was pretty much like, I mean, I understand the open to buy thing, but at a certain point the plug had to have been pulled out of the wall.
I don't know that it ever got pulled on my watch. I think when I left, there was still alpine snowboarding somewhere in the product line, or at least coming out of the prototype. Right.
But factory. I mean, back when you started, it was like half the product line was racing, you know?
Well, I think when you look at snowboard design today, there's a lot of alpine in a freestyle board.
Yeah.
And
you can rail them.
Yeah. That I remember the first time I ever really carved a snowboard was on a PJ.
Right.
An asymmetrical alpine board with just amazing side cut and super stiff. And I think once we started to all see that type of carving and experience that type of carving. We just expected it out of our freestyle boards, and we eventually pretty much got it.
Right. Yeah.
So maybe some of what was happening on alpine snowboards happens today, but it's on a freestyle shape.
Yeah. Yeah. So tell me a story. Like, what was like a highlight, like either riding or in terms of business from your time at Burton?
We could tell you a couple. One of them, I would say, one of the greatest experiences at Burton early on for me was the first big photo shoot we ever did in Val Thorens in France. And it was a who's who of pro athletes, 1993-ish.
Mm-hmm.
And, Terrier was there. A lot of the European riders.
Brushy was probably still on the team.
Yeah, Brush was there. Brian Iguchi was there.
Yeah.
And it just dumped snow the whole time. And, we actually had a hard time getting sunny days to shoot with. And then it would pummel snow again for another 2 or 3 days. And Jake was there. And whenever it was snowing and we couldn't shoot, we'd just all go free ride. Mm-hmm. So I'm like the new guy at Burton and, maybe saw these guys once a year at the US Open, but never actually rode with any of them. And suddenly I'm riding POW with the greatest snowboarders of the world and the godfather of the sport. And there was a moment where I wear glasses and I hate contacts and I wear my glasses underneath my goggles. Yeah. Super nerdy. And because it was just, a lot of water in the air. My goggles kept fogging up, and I had a hard time seeing. And we were looking at this jump, and I just couldn't see anything. And Jake's like, "Here, take this," and he handed me a linen handkerchief out of his pocket with his monogram JBC on it, and he's like, "That is the best goggle wipe ever made. Just keep it." And so I, wiped off my goggles, and we were all trying backflips because it was an epic powder day.
Right.
And Terrier did one, and I tried one, and I landed it. And
really?
It was just like,
cool.
And Terrier was like cheering. And I rode with that handkerchief in my pocket every day for like the next decade.
Nice.
It was like, it became sort of like my good luck charm, my lucky hat for fishing or something.
Nice.
But that was just, a incredible entree into sort of the culture of Burton. It was just a really great time. And I would say the other story I would share is much later. This is probably 2001-ish. Every few years you'd have a year where the riders were sort of like, I wonder if Burton's losing the plot. Mm-hmm. And it would have a sort of an annual rider roundtable at Jake's place in Long Island in late summer, and we'd go through the whole product line for the following year. And that would sort of bring, I think, a sense of athlete approval back to the product line, and we would edit some things out. But this year was particularly tense, I guess. And so we decided that we were going to take everybody to Costa Rica and go surf together rather than just go to Long Island. And
did you bring the product too, like all the whole
product? And I brought big foam core boards of all the marketing. I even had samples of like the hang tags for the jackets. I was like,
shipping container.
I'm like, we'll put everything on the table, you guys. Just please don't pull any punches. Just be direct as you want to be. So I got a phone call the night before we got on a plane from, I think it was Eric Koch, who's I don't think he was a team manager anymore, but he was sort of in the family. And he was like, "Hey, I'm just going to give you a heads up. When you get to Costa Rica, they're going to shave your head." And I had, as you know, way too much hair.
Yes,
I had a big, long ponytail.
Long hair. Yes, you had a ponytail.
I was definitely long hair. And so one of the things that the riders had decided was they thought it was corny to work for a guy that had a ponytail. Mm-hmm. And they wanted me to get rid of it. And so they gave me the heads up. I went and got an envelope for Locks for Love and had somebody cut the ponytail off and donate it
So you showed up with
kids
got
get-
a half a haircut.
Well, I had like
already?
this weird bob going, which then made it even easier for me to be ready to get my head shaved. But the third night, when people really felt like we were listening and things were going really well, somebody busted out the hair clippers and like they officially shaved my head. And I think Marcus Eggy was there, and I think he'd already shaved his head, but he sort of like looked around and said, "But what about the rest of us?" And then everybody on the whole team shaved their head in solidarity. And there's a photo that Blotto took of us on the beach where we all have shaved heads. Little Sean White included.
Really? Jake?
And Jake did not shave his head.
Okay.
I don't think he was even there for that moment. He might have if he had been in the room. But it was just like this affirmation again of, we would do anything for each other, and we're always listening, and give me any feedback, even if it's my hair. Like I'm listening. Yeah, and I never grew long hair after that. I think I learned a little something about style at that moment.
Right.
But yeah, I mean that's what life was like at Burton. I think that you were traveling, trying out new things for the sport, constantly being reminded by the riders of things that you might have missed or couldn't experience because you didn't ride at that level. And then being sort of validated when you did listen to their feedback, and either you experienced it yourself in the product or you watched riders everywhere resonate with something that they said or did, and you're like, man, they did it, they were right. Jake used to say that, like, he used to say, listen to the riders, they're right for two reasons. One, they do it more than you do, and two, if they're wrong, by example, they will make it right. Like, they can affect style, they can affect how we ride, they can invent tricks, they can make things work.
So what were some of like the greatest lessons that you learned like working for Burton? Obviously that was like your introduction to marketing, and you rose all the way to the top of a multi-$100 million company.
Well, I think on top of the sort of philosophical stuff, like learning to listen, I think, some of the more business oriented or marketing professional oriented lessons that came out of that era or that life experience for me has to do more with how I work with a team, a professional team of marketers. And one of the things that snowboard gave us was a lot of different people love snowboarding. It's a pretty diverse set of attitudes and life experiences that come at snowboarding. And I think the marketing teams over the years that we had reflected that. And, especially as we were endeavoring to be an even more connected brand in places outside the US. And so, one of the things I think that I learned was get a diverse team in a room, get a problem up on the wall, and just sort of session with it. I don't have a better word for it. It's like go back to skateboarding on a vert ramp where everybody's just, it's a skate session. We're all learning from each other. And watching other people think and watching them bounce ideas off of each other. And, you never think of this shit on your own. You just never could. You need brilliant minds in the room who, have different life experiences and are trying to explore different areas. And in a space like marketing where being the right kind of different is how you stand out, you need people who are different contributing.
Right.
So that was a really important lesson. And I think another one was as we got bigger, how do you continue to be the brand that you were when you were small? And I used to say at Burton, I've said it at Nike a few times too, you can be a cool brand by being a small brand, and you can be a big brand by being lame. but to be bigger and cooler at the same time is probably the toughest challenge in marketing or making a company, especially with a youth audience. And so, as we grew, as we got bigger, well, I didn't want us to get to be more lame. And that's where, I just go back to you and Pat and, listening to things that you guys would call us out on and be like, no, they're totally right. Like, that's like, this is losing the plot, or this is just doing it for making a buck, or this is just, we're taking the easy way out when we should really work at this and make it better for people. And just Jake used to say things like, you should never want people to wish that your logo was smaller on their board or their jacket. Like there was sort of having humility with your brand. We never put taglines in our ads. We just sort of felt like our job was to deliver another great photo in a magazine. And let the writing speak for itself. So I think there was the lesson in thinking small, being authentic, staying connected, no matter how big you get.
Right. It probably takes a lot more effort because it's easy to water things down as you grow, because it's like, we have so many people, but we need to make this many more products. We'll just, you can't put the same amount of detailed effort into it if you're not adding people and adding staff and really spending that same attention to those products as you grow.
Yeah, and I think that people try hard sometimes to talk you out of staying focused on the culture. I would, as best I could, I would take as many calls and respond to as many emails as I could if it was addressed directly to me. And a lot of times I would get letters or calls from parents, adults, and they would either be critical of something that was quote unquote edgy that we did in the marketing, or they would say, well, why don't you do more things to market to me? I don't think your marketing speaks to me. And you'd pause for a minute and go, well, maybe are we too edgy? Should we be acting more mature? And would that make us a bigger brand? Would we be more successful? And then you're like, no, hell no. Like what makes us great is not forgetting who we serve. We serve riders who ride every day. And we don't have to clean up our language or be totally accessible to every potential audience out there. We need to make sure that we're talking to snowboarders.
Right.
And the rest will follow. If they're really going to be into our sport, then come join us. Don't ask us to change. There were some really heated conversations at times, even with people who worked at the company, as to why be youth oriented. There was a famous page in one of the Burton catalogs. It was page 56. And it's, I think it's UC Oksanen is on a rail giving the finger to the camera.
Mm-hmm.
And we got so much parental heat for that. Today it sounds pretty innocent, but I guess if it came in your mailbox in those days, it was very personal.
Yeah.
We got so much heat. And again, go back to the fishbowl and Banta and the rider service crowd. They'd be like, man, the phone's just ringing off the hook. People just hate page 56. And I'm like, every year, let there be a page 56.
Yeah.
If you don't love our brand, when you look at page 56, you should be riding somebody else's snowboards. I just think and what we didn't do it to be edgy, or to be provocative. It was just something that
it was authentic.
Yeah. UC did it and it was funny. So we ran it.
Yeah.
If he had given the thumbs up, then we probably would have run the same shot.
Yeah.
So it's bigger and cooler at the same time was maybe one of the biggest lessons from Bert.
Well, that's a nice segue into your job after Burton, because eventually you left Burton. Why did you actually leave Burton? Because it seems like you had probably the best job in the entire snowboard industry, right?
It was wonderful. I loved Burton. I still love Burton. I love the people. I love Vermont. But I was getting close to 40, and it was the only thing I'd really done professionally. And it felt like snowboarding as a business was just going to stay the same size or be the same challenge for the rest of my life.
Well, it is now that you left. Jeez, thanks a lot.
Well, we had, you got to remember the context. When I left in 03, I guess it was, or 03, 04, I guess. There had just been the Salt Lake Olympics in 02. So, we had a tortured relationship with the IOC, but at the end of the day, we wanted our athletes to prevail and have a great competition and, get the respect and attention that they deserved. So when we saw such positive momentum coming out of the Olympics for snowboarding and for Burton riders, it sort of felt like I had checked a really big box in my career and, trying to enable that to happen. And, we had seen such a dominant position for snowboarding now in winter sports. Everybody knew what it was. They stopped putting quotes on the word when they wrote it in news, and it just felt like snowboarding had arrived, and that felt like that was my calling for those 10 or 12 years. So now snowboarding has arrived. Like, what do I do with the rest of my life? And I didn't have a really good answer. I think Jake's answer was, I'm going to go on an around the world trip for a year with my family and really experience life worldwide. And hey, Schreiber and a few others, can you guys stay back and sort of mind the store? And I think, 60 days after Jake had left on his around the world trip, we were having a conversation. I think he was in Cambodia on the sat phone. And I'm like, I got to get out of here. Like, I need a new challenge. And he totally respected that. And, like I said, it was very amicable, and he still hooked me up with gear. Thanks, Jake. You rock. Still go to the fall bash when I get back there. But I really wanted to try something new. And I think there was a little bit of fear, maybe not with Jake, but maybe with, he had an advisory board. Was I leaving Burton because I had something up my sleeve in snowboarding? And I didn't. I really had no idea what I was going to do next. I thought I might write a book, or who knows.
But you left basically and didn't have another job lined up.
I walked out the door into
you must have had some savings.
The January cold with a little bit of savings. But oddly enough, literally my last day, I had all my shit in a box. My desk phone was ringing. I just felt compelled to answer it one more time. And it was a recruiter from Nike. And I asked her, I'm like, how did you know this is my last day? And she was like, I didn't, but let's talk. And I hated Nike. They were the villain in snowboarding. I felt in my era, they were the competition. They were arrogant. I felt had lost the plot with youth. I just had a lot of sort of negative associations with that company. And I really didn't want to talk to Nike. But after a few months of going back and forth, I had the opportunity to come out to Beaverton, to Nike campus, and meet the people who were driving the marketing of the company. Sandy Bodecker, who had become a name in skate through Nike SB, was somebody who I hadn't yet met, and I had the opportunity to sit down with him. Trevor Edwards, who would go on to become the president of the company at that time, was the brand new CMO. I got to meet him and a few others. And the conversation I had with those guys was totally something I didn't expect. They were utterly hip to my criticisms of the brand and wanted to hear from me more about
Really? So you
how to
sat
fix it.
down initially and you were like, here's how you guys are lame. Let's just sit down. Let's get it out of the way here.
Yeah, probably the worst interview strategy ever.
Right.
But they listened, and it wasn't like they had heard it this was the first time they'd heard it. In fact, Trevor pulled up a slide, and he said, this is a slide we've been presenting from a deck we've been presenting internally about all the little companies that are coming up, with youth brands that are taking a chunk out of Nike's business. And a Gravis sticker was the biggest sticker on the slide. And he's like, there's a reason why we want to recruit you. You are hip to something that we don't have enough of, and we want to have you come in here and figure out how we work, and then maybe figure out how to work together, and let's change the brand. The other sort of thing that turned my attention to Nike also was they had just hired Fraser Cook, who was, and probably still is, the head sneakerhead in the universe. And I'd known Fraser for a long time, and somehow he was able to work for this corporation called Nike, and I'm like, wow, Fraser's there. Well, maybe I need to really take a second look. So it took about 6 months of going back and forth, but they finally convinced me to give them a shot, and they gave me sort of a bullshit made up job so that...
What was that job?
It was called a global concept director. And in my orientation, Nike does an orientation every Monday with new employees, and each person has to get up and say what they've been hired to do. And I just said, I'm the global concept director. I've been hired to direct concepts that are global. And I sat back down again. I had no idea what that meant. But what it turned into was I still have the sheet of paper, but on my second day, Trevor Edwards gave me a sheet of paper, and it said a list of things that maybe the brand had tried to get after but hadn't put enough attention into yet, either because it was something that had to happen on a really short timeline, or it took a really long timeline, but it wasn't on the business cycle of Nike. And Dermot Cleary, who was my boss at the time, sat with me in that sheet of paper, and he's like, is there anything on this list that you would want to do? And one of them was Nike ID. And I had just left Burton, who was developing Series 13, the Nike ID of snowboarding, and referencing everything Nike had already done in Nike ID. So I was very familiar with that proposition. And I was like, sign me up for that one. There was a thing on that list called Featherweight, which involved working with the guys in the Nike Innovation Kitchen to develop a new lightweight foam, which that became a Nike career-long endeavor, because that turned into lunar foam in a lot of Nike shoes, but ultimately led to the foam that was used in the 2-hour marathon attempt last year that we called Breaking 2. So I said, sign me up for lightweight. I like that idea. And then the third one on there was a thing called Game Fuel, which was an idea of how do we turn physical activity into currency and gamify activity beyond just the scoreboard in sports. And that led to the Nike Fuel Band, which was a pretty interesting thing for a few years there. So I signed up for 3 projects that ultimately turned into really big deals for Nike, but at the time, no one was really working on. And it gave me enough space for a couple of years to try some things without a lot of commercial expectations from the company, and without me having to be great at operating in Nike's corporate environment.
Was it culture shock coming from Vermont, Burlington, out here to like the biggest sporting goods company in the world?
It's funny. It was almost the opposite. I was braced for incredible culture shock. However, Portland, Oregon is sort of the Burlington, Vermont of the West. So from a city standpoint, it felt like home. Nike is as driven to listen to and to listen to and serve athletes as Burton ever was. Phil Knight was still very involved in the company, so I knew what it was like to have the founder in the room and to hear the founder's point of view on what we're trying to do. So there were some really familiar things going on at Nike coming out of Burton. And then there was also the opportunity afforded to me that Nike was aware that people like me coming from these little brands had some
Burton being a little brand.
Yes, I know.
Yeah,
Funny,
right.
isn't it? But
yeah.
to them, I guess we were.
Yeah.
But people wanted to listen to what we had to say.
Mm-hmm.
And, I remember being sort of shocked when I got to Burton as a Burton retailer coming in to be a Burton employee, and I would be in meetings and I would say, well, in the shop we would, and the whole room would suddenly look at me and fully engage in what I was saying. Like I was bringing them this incredible intelligence fresh from the field. And that same reaction at Nike, I would, talk about why Gravis was so successful in Japan, and there would be this hush over the room, and I'd be like, wow, they're like really listening. They listen.
That's pretty cool.
So the first couple of years were really important sort of onboarding for me at Nike. And, it gave me time for the learning curve that I still needed to really understand how to communicate big ideas inside of a big company.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things that Nike's corporate culture, I think, is really great for, is if you can get a big idea over the top at Nike, you've survived the most challenging gauntlet.
Hey folks, if you're tuning in to us still, please take a minute to go to Patreon.
Wait.
What?
Is there like some question that they wouldn't still be tuning in?
Well, if they're still listening, they can go to patreon.com/the Snowboard Project.
But you're still staying still.
Still.
Like they
They might
not
have just
even
listened
made
to
it
the
this
first
far.
5 minutes. Yeah, they
Okay.
might not have made it this far. So.
Okay.
But I just want, if you're still listening, okay, if you're listening, go to patreon.com/the Snowboard Project, and we're going to count on you guys to support an independent voice in snowboarding media. It's how we're going to keep this thing advertising free and have a voice that is not affected by the advertisers. What was the first big idea that went over the top?
Well, one of the things that I felt like I was influential through was Nike ID. When I started, Nike ID was already a thing. It was a couple years old, and it really only offered people the opportunity to take a running shoe, a technical running shoe, and flip a few colors on it or change the traction of the outsole. And yet what was happening in the world was sneaker culture was being born.
Mm-hmm.
And people like me who grew up with Nike sneaker boxes under his bed and in the closet, and, I had these exotic running shoes, but I never ran track or ran at all, suddenly had this identity put upon us that we were sneakerheads, which I think we embraced. And I looked at Nike ID as an opportunity for people to love sneakers. If you ran in them, great. If you just wore them around, that's cool too. But I felt like what was happening in the art and design world wasn't being reflected in what was being offered through Nike ID. And so I worked with some really great designers. Andy Walker is one of them at Nike, to explore what's possible with options when you sit down and want to design a shoe. Jesse Leva, who is a brilliant footwear designer, who was doing a lot of the most coveted sneaker designs worked with me, and he brought in some great leathers that were from an automotive upholstery supplier that we could put onto shoes. And we just opened up the palette to what was possible in designing your own shoes. And we got our hands on the most iconic footwear designs that Nike had, like the Dunk and the Air Force One, that up until then had been sort of forbidden fruit for the Nike ID team. So, I mean,
So how did you get that? How did you talk like someone who really kind of cherished and tried to guard that image of the Dunk, and how did you talk them into like letting you just let anybody have free reign over their own Dunks?
Well, I think there was enough awareness within Nike of what we had done at Burton in terms of brand sanctity and making sure that certain things were sort of held sacred so that we didn't ruin snowboarding. We did our best to serve riders and, not just decorate snowboards, but put real fine art. You think of like Scott Lenhart painting something beautiful for a snowboard. So I think there was a respect already of maybe the point of view that I was bringing to the room of we can do more with these iconic footwear styles than we're doing, and it can be something good for the company and for the people who love these shoes, not something commercial. But also I had to take things a step at a time. The Air Force One is one of the most important footwear designs in the Nike pantheon. It is maybe the most important shoe in the history of the company.
Yeah, you get offed if you messed it up.
Yes. And there is a salesman, I guess I would call him, Sam Siegel. He's an independent contractor like a rep would be in snowboarding, but he's been with Nike forever. And he's the guy who learned how to make the Air Force One available to youth without making it too available. So, I love Kohl's, but maybe the Kohl's isn't the place where you want to sell an Air Force One.
Right.
But I also love sneaker shops that are in cities like New York, and they probably should be the shops that get to sell the Air Force One. Well, he was the godfather of Air Force One who figured out how to allocate quantities of shoes to these stores and to listen to the stores about what colors were working. And so he really held the keys to the Air Force One. So I had to go sit with Sam and explain to him that at least in the beginning, we were only going to give a very few consumers access to the Air Force One, and that if it wasn't working, we could shut it off tomorrow. It's not like we're putting a lot of inventory out on shelves. And he placed a bet on me that I wouldn't screw it up. But he did say, if you screw it up, a van is going to pull up, grab you, and no one's ever going to see you again. And
You were not even kidding, huh?
Serious. It might have actually happened to someone before me.
Oh boy. But you believed in your idea anyway enough where you're like, this is the right thing to do, and and I'm not going to mess it up because I regard it so highly.
Yeah, and like he knew I was a sneakerhead, and he knew that it wasn't just that my heart was in the right place, but that I had demonstrated for over 10 years with Burton that I could keep a brand or a product in the right place too. So, and he and I went on to have a really tremendous friendship professionally. And we did a lot of really great things with the Air Force One after that. But that really, from a consumer standpoint and also from within Nike's corporate culture, expanded people's minds about what it means to love sneakers. And it really, this is 2004, 2005. There were absolutely people collecting sneakers at that point, but sneaker culture was not a major component in youth culture or popular culture yet. And what we did with Nike ID, and then what we did with some of those franchises like the Air Force One and the Dunk in the years to follow, built on this idea of how important sneakers can be in popular culture.
Right.
So, pretty awesome first 2 years at Nike and pretty intense.
So what was your next
Siegel.
job title? So first you're directing Global Concepts, which conceptually was an interesting idea in practice and in theory.
Well, it's funny because when I started at Nike, a lot of the conversations that I had with people was around more the lifestyle side of the sneaker business. And yet I was way more eager to work on the more technical performance side of the business. So when I pursued that other concept around Featherweight that sort of turned into Lunar Foam, I got way involved with product development and some of the top innovators at Nike, and I got really passionate about working in that space. So although I spent some time working on more of the lifestyle side of the biz, and that never went away, that was been a part of my career at Nike the whole time, I did get a chance to work on some really innovative performance side of the business. So I started working in the athletic training team where, I don't resemble the typical athletic training consumer. I wasn't at the time working out in gyms or doing a lot of dynamic training. I didn't play football in high school, but that was the environment that I wanted to be in, and that's the folks that I wanted to be working with. I had an incredible partner in crime, the vice president, general manager of the training category at Nike, Chris Amon, who was a great high school athlete, and who really did understand training culture. He really indulged me in my sort of countercultural points of view that I would bring to the table. So I would bring more of this skate culture take.
Did you ever get rebuffed? Were they ever like, you're out of your mind?
Not really. Chris was really great at defending me to the broader team if I said something that was totally whack. But Chris and I hatched this idea of how could we go get the NFL uniform license. I mean, that had been floating around Nike for a while, but we were the ones that were going to go do that, we decided. And we worked with Charlie Denson, who, the president of the company at the time, and we had a really great team working with us to go pitch the NFL on, hey, if we had the partnership with your marks, this is what we would do with it. And we created this insane presentation together, videos. We built out a room in New York City. We mocked up uniforms. I mean, we put together the most insane presentation that you could imagine, and tried a bunch of things that came from a little bit from my life experience in surf, skate, snow, including sort of pushing the envelope in telling a story graphically. Mm-hmm. And, through iconic colors and little coded designs, how do you take a uniform and tell a whole story with it? And the pitch went really great. And it worked out with the NFL. And then amazingly, Pete Carroll and the Seahawks utterly embraced our approach to reinventing the NFL uniform from a performance standard, like how lightweight could we make it, how breathable could we make it, how durable could we make it, but also from a graphic standpoint, what kind of visual statement can we make? Can we tell a story? the story of the Seahawks, the
So
story
was
of their
that coming
fans.
from the action sports background,
Yeah,
the Burton
and
background? Because it's
totally.
like the board graphic is like almost in some people's minds as important as the board performance, right?
Well,
like you have
it's-
to like the graphic you're riding.
You
on
could
a
certainly,
board.
yeah. I'd say you could love a board and not ride it because you hate the graphic.
Yeah.
I don't know that if you hated the board, you'd ride it because you love the graphic.
Yeah,
Maybe so.
yeah, that's it.
But you could definitely get turned off by it.
Yep.
But I would be in meetings with folks from the NFL, marketing people and licensing people, and I would reference things that I had done in snowboarding, and they were aware of my background. And then I would sort of, wait to see their reaction. And they would be like, "No, absolutely. We're all ears. This is
youth culture
this is
live."
this is the voice of youth we're looking for." So it was great that sort of as a next step at Nike to take listening and observing culture into a performance space.
Mm-hmm.
So, at the same time, you've got an NFL athlete talking about what their uniform needs to perform. You're also engaging them in a conversation about, well, how should it make you feel when you put it on, and what story do you want it to tell about you and your team?
Mm-hmm.
And that felt really fresh in that space.
Yeah.
And was really exciting for me to be a part of, and maybe made me better at my job because I didn't play football. At Burton, I could snowboard, and I couldn't avoid bringing my point of view as a snowboarder into the room sometimes. But with football, I had no point of view.
Were you like a fan, like watching on Sundays or whatever?
A casual fan.
Mm-hmm.
My grandmother was a huge football fan, so I grew
what's your
up
team?
around. I am leaning towards the 49. I just bought a Carhartt 49ers collab beanie yesterday online. Now that I'm in San Francisco, I'm going to get behind the 49ers.
All right.
Coming from New England, I guess I was a Patriots fan before that. But the values of understanding what athletes need to perform, inclusive of both technical performance as well as sort of psychological or cultural performance, for lack of a better term. That's a really important lesson that I think I took from Burton. People at Nike were willing to listen to, people at the NFL were willing to listen to, and we had some amazing results. I mean, 2 years into this thing, the Seahawks won the Super Bowl. I couldn't believe it. I'm like in New York going, we did it. We got the most innovative uniforms ever onto NFL players with a visual identity that makes a real statement, a departure maybe from what NFL teams have ever looked like before, and they won the Super Bowl.
Yeah.
So it sort of felt like another graduation.
That's what that ring is all about.
Totally. You can hear it clanging against the table.
Yeah. I'm kidding. But so were there any things that you like tried to take from Burton, from action sports, and brought to, say, Nike that didn't work, that where you took this like youth culture or culture from, that you had learned by working at Burton, and then brought it to Nike, to performance, to other sports, and then it kind of didn't work, and that became a learning lesson for you?
I can give you two examples of that. One of them is kind of comical. So when you design a shoe on Nike ID, a lot of the shoes give you the opportunity to write a word or two on the shoe. And, a lot of people will write their name or their favorite team. But potentially, if unmoderated, you could write a lot of nasty things on a shoe that, as a company or just as a person working for the company, I don't want to appear to be endorsing.
Right.
So, you can work with a agency that provides a profanity filter. So with each Nike ID design, it gets run.
Poets can get profane without swear words.
Yes. Totally. Well, you're actually furthering my story.
Okay.
is people get very creative when confronted with a profanity filter that won't let them say certain words by either creatively spelling them or coming up with new words to talk about things that maybe the people who are in charge aren't hip to those meanings yet. It's like the Urban Dictionary, but moving very fast.
Right.
So at Nike, at the end of the day, somebody has to, literally at the end of each business day, somebody has to review all of the words that are being placed on the shoes beyond those that are rejected by the machine and go, do any of these look like they're trying to say something that, we really don't want to have said on our shoes? And those get added to the list. Well, you can imagine that the list is...
And how many of these are like coming in every day?
Yeah.
Like there's like hundreds or thousands of them.
Yeah. So, I mean, at the time when I committed this mistake, that list was probably 10,000 words, and I use that term loosely, long. But we did a pop-up Nike ID studio where you could make an appointment and sit down with a design consultant and design a pair of shoes with access to some colors and materials and styles that you couldn't get by going to Nike.com.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it'd be really funny to do a little book in the bathroom, in the stalls, that had the printout of the entire profanity list.
Mm-hmm.
And I took out things that were hate speak. It was just dirty words.
What, so people thought they could put the hate speak on?
People try everything.
Yeah.
And I thought it was funny. I thought it was sort of my George Carlin 7 dirty words moment of putting it in the bathroom. And we were doing a media event, and we had some pretty heavy hitters in terms of journalists and New York artists coming through to do the experience and write about it. And somebody in the Nike PR department used the restroom and just came out mortified with this book in her hand. And she's like, oh my God, like what? Somebody's trying to like sabotage our event. They put this book, like, this is all the media will write about. Like, they won't talk about any of the work that we've done to make this place great. They're just going to write about this. And I was like, oh, that is terrible. We should remove that immediately. Let's put it in the dumpster out back. Because at Burton...
That was like page 56.
Yeah, but what I hadn't thought through was, I think when you're at the scale that you are at Nike... you have a really big target on your back, and people might want to only write about the provocative things that you did and not really talk about things that we work really hard on. Jesse Leva is doing great footwear designs. Andy Walker had done this amazing space design. I had Mark Smith sitting there co-designing, and their work was about to be overlooked entirely because I was pulling some publicity stunt in the bathroom with a book of dirty words.
Get your mind out of the gutter, Dave.
So yeah, that didn't work out well. That was something from Burton that probably doesn't apply well in a lot of other places.
Yeah. Anything else that doesn't apply?
One of the things I think I had to learn at Nike that was different from the culture that I grew up in at Burton was that I think that if you skate or snowboard or surf, you've got pretty thick skin when it comes to being criticized or dissed.
Yeah, everyone hated us at a point in time.
Yeah,
everyone, skiers, skaters, surfers, they all hated snowboarders.
I'm not, foolish enough to think that there aren't other groups of people in the world who get subjected to more intolerance than, say, a skateboarder, but we got a lot of intolerance skateboarding. And I think when you grow up in that culture, you become very direct with one another. And even within Burton, we were very direct with one another, and the riders would tell us if something sucked.
That's also kind of an East Coast thing. I
That's
find.
probably East Coast too. And
You
this
know,
is not the
they
East
stab you in
Coast.
the chest on the East Coast, and in California they stab you in the back.
Yeah. So I arrive at Nike with the same sort of communication style that I left Burton with, which was if something's not great, you just say it. And and if something's great, you lavish praise on it, but you're very transparent and direct with your feedback. And it's not that people at Nike didn't want to hear the feedback, but
they couldn't take it.
No, I'll tell you what the difference was. When you're a smaller company, I think it's easier to feel secure that everybody around you knows that you're contributing. And if somebody says something negative about your work, it isn't career defining with your bosses.
Right.
Because they already know you and they know that you do great work. And if this one thing receives a little bit of negative criticism, they know how you're going to make it better. But I think at Nike or at a bigger company, when you're that direct in front of a group, the person you're talking to, all they can think about is everybody else in the room thinks that I do bad work. And their boss could be in the room, or somebody that their boss listens to is in the room, and they're going, man, this is not going to help me get ahead in life.
Doesn't that stifle progression though? I mean, what do you have to do, a shit sandwich and tell them something good, then the criticism, and then something good again at the
I
end?
think it's on a continuum, and I think Nike's really great at embracing feedback. I think that how you package up and present that feedback requires a little more diplomacy when there's a lot of people in the room that don't know each other, or who maybe they don't know you that well. And so you have to be choosy with the things that you really want to criticize or change, to so don't be frivolous about what you are pointing out needs to be fixed. And I think you have to be thoughtful in how you word things. Nike's got some really great code in how people speak to one another in a way that is both respectful and direct. Rather than say you hate something, you can just say, I'm not on board with that. And everybody in the room is
like translator.
Yeah,
right?
But when you say I'm not on board with that in front of a group of people, you're immediately reminding them that it's your opinion. Like, you're not expecting everybody else to have the same opinion.
Right.
You can decide if I'm important enough that if I'm not on board, you need to change it. And I'm not really judging your work. I'm just making it about how I feel. And I think that's something that
it's not like that sucks. It's like, I'm not down with that.
Yeah, I'm not down with it.
Yeah.
And that learning how to, for lack of a better word, modulate how criticism came out of my mouth was a really important
Okay. Maybe
gear
you could give me a little lesson here. What are some other code words I can use in my life to be more diplomatic? I'm not very diplomatic still. I'm very direct. I throw overhand out of their hands.
Yeah, well, it's not like I ever mastered this one either, but I'll tell you a few things. One, this is a word that you hear a lot at Nike. When somebody is belaboring a point to you that you're already on board with,
right,
and you don't need to be beat over the head with it anymore, you just say check.
Right, check that box.
If you just
check.
David, like we've discussed, what I need you to do is this, and this. And
check.
I go, check.
Yeah.
And then everybody stands down. If I say check, it means I've heard and understood.
It's like Roger that.
Yeah, and
right?
I will now proceed following that direction.
Yes, that box will be checked here shortly.
Yeah, versus like, yeah, I got you. So I think
that's
check
a good
is
one.
An important word. And then I think another one, this is very much like Burton, but sometimes I think when there's a debate going on in the room and there are two very polar sides to the conversation, somebody just has to say, yeah, but what's right for the consumer? And I think when you say it that way, again, it isn't.
You're taking the opinions out of it and being like, no, it's not your opinion or my opinion that matters.
Yes.
It's the person who's buying it and what they're going to think about it.
Yeah, and it makes it less about which side in this room is going to win the argument. And it takes it to, there's another side to this, which is there's a person outside the room that loves this brand.
Is there an equivalent in politics for that?
Yeah, I know. I was aware of the parallels of what I was saying as those words came out.
You said polarized, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I think when you remind people why we're all here, who we're serving, it takes some of the impersonal, opinions and emotion and
that's
need
good.
to win. The ego maybe comes out of it a little bit, and it turns back into being in the service of someone else.
Oh, hey guys, Beav here with Sullivan, and we're talking about Patreon. I know, it's one of those things that we gotta throw in there, but check this out. It's because of people like you that go and get on the internet and go to Patreon and support us for as little as, what, $2 a month?
Yeah.
It's people like you that help us do this.
Yeah, but people are like, no, it's free. It's a free podcast,
Right.
Beav. We don't need to pay for this. We can get it for free.
Yeah, I know.
The way that we're going to tell these independent stories is by having people support us. Right now, we got about 108 people supporting us. Not a lot.
108?
108.
Still pretty rad.
It is pretty rad, yeah.
There's 108 people out there that are supporting us on Patreon.
Yeah.
Right on.
With your support, as little as $2 a month, we can continue to push this ball downfield to continue to tell these real stories in snowboarding.
So, what are some the most important lessons that you kind of maybe learned at Burton and still apply at Nike and or on your next ventures? What are the kind of the most important lessons that you're like, check?
Well, I touched on it earlier. It was even more important at Nike is the power of diversity. Mm-hmm. You need teams of people who are very different from one another, who have very different life experiences, who have very different points of view, who have very different aspirations, working together to solve the problem. Mm-hmm. And I just cannot emphasize that enough as something that I learned again and again, that were it not for such a diverse group of people in the room, we never would have come up with some of the coolest things that we ever came up with. And we would make maybe some very tone deaf decisions were it not for people in the room who had different cultural filters and would understand what those words or that picture might mean in a different context.
Right. It seems like it would be easy to water things down to the point where they're not actually significant or relevant to at least some people, by taking only a few opinions into account. How do you stay on that edge? How do you stay on the sharp edge where it's still relevant to the cutting edge and yet and it's still, how do you maintain that sharp edge?
Well, I think you can ask of the work, is this innovative? Is this something that we've never seen before? Is this a new way of solving a nagging old problem? Does this open up new possibilities? I think you can challenge the work with questions like that, and mediocre work doesn't survive that test. I also think that authenticity is where culture comes from, and I think the more authentic you are to your point of view and to who you're serving, the more culturally relevant or connected I think you are. And that also kills mediocre work. I know there was a moment where in marketing, a designer took a photo of a former college basketball player who was then at the time in the NBA and flopped the shot. So he went from being left to right-handed and, selected a shot where he couldn't see his face and used it in a piece of marketing as if that person were a college player. And
That's not very authentic.
well, what's great about people who are really into things is immediately kids called us out of like, that's so-and-so. You guys flopped the shot and you picked one where you couldn't see his face, but I know his style. That's definitely him. And, it wasn't like we got in a ton of trouble for it, but it was like a little bit of a blunder of like, why would we do something inauthentic like that? And I remember Mark Parker, the CEO, commenting on it at some point. It came up in a conversation. He's like, yeah, he goes, I would way rather have people talking about our work because it was innovative or distinctive or challenging a status quo versus have them talking about something we did that was mediocre and saved us some time,
Right.
And so I think like that's the authenticity thing is huge. And again, if you have a diverse group of people, somebody in the room is going to be able to pick up on why that is or isn't real.
Yeah. Out of every group, are you looking for like a certain percentage of them not to be on board because if you're presenting ideas that everyone agrees with, maybe they're not innovative?
That's a really great question. I know that I've had to conclude meetings or conversations about work by saying, hey, I understand that not everybody in the room is going to be on board with this one, but I think that there's a convincing number of us who are on board that we're going to go ahead with it.
Screw you,
Totally.
screw you.
Well, I think one thing that I've been criticized for this before by maybe inviting too many people to the meeting or waiting for everyone in the room to be heard. But I think it's important that if people are in the room, to me, it's an expectation. If you're going to come to a meeting where we're developing creative or a strategy, you're not there to be an observer. You're there to have a point of view and speak up.
Mm-hmm.
And if you haven't spoken up, I'll call on you and ask you to speak up.
What's the ideal size group? I mean, I can imagine you have 20, 30 people in that room. And
That's
it's
too
like,
big.
And then
Yeah.
you're just like, oh, I can't even remember what the first person said.
I think 6 or 8 people
Okay.
is a pretty good creative
Focus
session.
group kind of.
Yeah,
Or
and I
like
think
a brainstorming session kind of thing.
We had a thing going at Nike that I just called Creative Review, and it was a weekly meeting where we would review any work that was going to see the consumer in the next few weeks. So pretty much things nearly in its finished state. And that would be a much bigger room because it benefited, in that case, an audience of people to watch the 6 of us discuss something.
Mm-hmm.
Because then they might become hip to something that we're seeing and talking about before it's their turn to present the work.
Right.
So we're all kind of learning together, but not everybody is participating. But that's when you're really looking at something that's nearly final. When you're in the beginning and you're trying to really be creative, I think it gets really hard when you get to the point where, in the course of an hour, you can't hear from everyone.
Yeah.
If everybody's going to talk for 4 or 5 minutes, 20 people, you're overtime.
Yeah.
So I think, managing the size of the group when everybody's trying to make something is really important. But having some people in the peanut gallery when you're presenting, a bigger group might actually benefit from overhearing that conversation.
Mm-hmm. Right. So that's pretty interesting. So what was like your final job title? Because you're now moving on and like.
Yeah, so from 2012 to the beginning of 16, I was the VP of brand marketing for North America. So
That sounds pretty important.
that was probably as cool as any other job I've ever had.
I guess you had a number of jobs at Nike, but
Yeah.
you had one job before that.
But even at Burton, it was like
Yeah.
I had a bunch of different jobs at Burton. But
Yeah.
I think being able to lead a massive team and a massive brand.
How many people reported to you in that job?
We had probably 400 or 500 people
Wow.
in the broader marketing team in North America. We were challenged by the company to grow the business and grow the brand at a time when I think the tech brands had a lot of youth's attention.
Mm-hmm.
And the top 5 brands were the big brands of tech and social media: Apple, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter. And Nike was sort of bouncing around in that top 5, but usually in 3rd or 4th place. And when I got into that job, it was basically my mandate, like, let's find a way to be the number 1 brand.
Mm-hmm.
And over the next 4 years, we did it. We, by most people's measure, were the biggest and coolest brand.
Mm-hmm.
I'd say probably for people under 30, and that may speak for all of us too. But, that was a really awesome moment in my career that was then followed by 2 really great years leading all of the Nike creative engines in the marketing space globally. So take the creative piece that was working in North America and how do you take those lessons and scale them globally?
Wow.
Which led to some really fun projects in China, some really great projects around European, football teams out of Europe, just more sport insights that, again, like when I worked on the NFL, didn't come from my own life experience, would have to come from me listening to teams that
Mm-hmm.
really lived it and really knew it to be authentic. And just at a time in the last few years where it isn't necessarily about a 60-second commercial anymore. It's what can you get across in the first 5 seconds before a YouTube video rolls?
Right.
Or what can you...
The short attention span theater
Yeah.
is really here.
The blipverts really did happen.
Yeah.
And, the thumb scroll through an Instagram feed where you've got a second and a half to tell your story, which it's a little bit like snowboarding. Do
you think that sacrifices, though, the ability to connect with consumers? If you're trying to get this broad or this expansive message across in like a thumb scroll, how do you really get a rich message across with such a short attention span?
Well, I think what you do is you step back and realize that what we know of brands or even celebrities or great stories, it didn't all come to us at once. We didn't sit down and learn everything we know about something in one seating.
Mm-hmm.
We picked up little bits and pieces along the way, and we built a picture in our heads that is consistent with all those parts. And in a world where now you are experiencing storytelling in these little bits and pieces, if you think about that journey and you put all the right pieces in all the right places, don't underestimate consumers, athletes.
Interesting.
They'll compile all of those great bits and
Right.
pieces into a whole story.
Right, it's a jigsaw puzzle, and you have to like give them all the pieces,
Yeah.
and then they're building
Let them
this
put it
jigsaw.
together. And they
then-
might put it together in a different way than you fully expected, but they're still going to put together a
Right.
picture.
But they have that brand vision of what Nike is, and all of those jigsaw puzzles fall under that same vision.
It goes back to the question you asked me about Burton. As the media landscape got more complicated, how do we stay us in all those different places? And I think once you know how to do that, if those places are very widely scattered and in very brief moments, they still work if the pieces of the puzzle all come together to be something meaningful. I love, one of my favorite ways to do marketing is to not tell the whole story, but to leak little bits and pieces out and get people to start guessing what's next and what does it mean. When we did 7, the series of snowboards at Burton, we called it 7 not for any particular reason. There happened to be 7 riders at the time, and when we did it, everybody was like, well, they're all going to think that we called it 7 because there's 7 of us. What if there's an 8th person? And I'm like, but we didn't say it was
No,
7
Burton's
people.
got that team. That never happened.
So we would do things all the time to imply what 7 meant, but we would never confirm or deny what 7 stood for. And it just gave people the opportunity to talk about and imagine and challenge one another about what's the meaning of 7.
Right. And they can almost create a piece of that in their minds, and it becomes a piece of their story as well.
And that, to me, is some of the most powerful marketing, where you're pretty much telling consumers, riders, athletes, hey, this is your story. You tell us what it means. Take what we have, which comes from a really authentic place, but you're living this, so make something with it.
Right.
And I think that's, with social media now, something that you can do very effectively. I can take a story and retell it in my own words and blast it out to all my friends, and now it's me telling the story, not the company. So it's
I'm going to think about that. I'm going to think about that one a little bit more. It's got me thinking. Okay, so now you're kind of no longer with Nike, or you're maybe consulting a little bit or something. I'm sure they don't want to let you. They don't want to let the hook off of you, so you go to Adidas or something. That would not be cool, right? But so what are you going to do? Like 10 years from now, where are you going to be?
Well, I'll tell you what fascinates me right now. One thing that we touched on that I find fascinating is now more than ever, it's possible for a brand to have a relationship directly one-on-one with a consumer.
That was always the goal of marketers, one-on-one marketing. Yeah.
And, it still meant something back in the day to get a Burton catalog in your mailbox with an address label that had your name on the back of it. And you knew that your friend was going to have to go down to the shop and try to find a copy down there, but you had yours. Like, that still felt personal. But of course, the potential to be personally addressed by a company is infinite with the opportunities through digital. So I'm fascinated by that direct-to-consumer communications channel, and what goes with it is also that direct-to-consumer. If there's something that I want to provide to you or sell to you or serve you with, I can do that directly to you. I don't have a middle person that I necessarily have to go through or convince to get them to buy into what you and I both know you really want. And I still believe in shop culture, and I still believe in the idea of wholesale retailers, and I still believe in bricks and mortar retail. But I also believe that the opportunity to additionally go to a flagship or deal directly with a company one-on-one to get the goods that those other channels don't have, or get a piece of the story that they don't have, is a great thing too. And so I'm fascinated by just going direct. And then I'm also fascinated with how it seems like popular culture is less about stuff you have and more about experiences you're having. And I think Instagram might have opened our eyes to something.
Yeah.
Like, it's kind of lame to go on Instagram and be like, check out my new watch.
Yeah.
Like, but it's not lame on Instagram to
check out India.
Yeah,
or check out Bombay.
Yeah, or
right?
just check out this blower turn I just made.
Yeah.
Or the opportunity to share cool experiences that you're having through Instagram has almost made that kind of a currency of status, whereas maybe in other generations things were currencies of status, and which is great because I think sometimes less consumption is better, and doing things might be better than having things. A world where people are curious and active and exploring is, probably a better world than one with less of those things.
Right. Highly curated, incredible life that
Yes.
everyone leads that I know.
And, and not everything on Instagram is real or to be believed, but a lot of it's genuine. And I am fascinated with how can brands become more about serving experiences and less about just selling stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I love stuff, and some stuff
You like more than other stuff.
I mean, a great snowboard innovation, sign me up. If it's going to make me a better rider, I'm in. So I'm not anti making things and buying things at all, but doing things is really cool. And I think that I would love to be, in the next 10 years, a bigger part of enabling people to do things and enabling them to do things through brands they can talk to and exchange with directly.
It's interesting.
Which kind of takes me all the way back to maybe skate camp in the beginning.
Yeah.
Because when I wanted to have a skateboard shop and I didn't have enough money to buy the inventory that I wanted or build the showcase that I wanted, I had a skateboard camp. And it was that cash that was really the seed money that started the business. But what I learned in having those skate camps was how much I loved watching kids discover that they could ollie.
Yep.
Or land a trick that they never thought they could possibly land. And I think that's informed my whole career of how do I help people discover things about themselves that they didn't already know.
Yeah.
Or didn't think that they could
That's
do.
what I've been doing with the last 10 years of my life, introducing people to the rite of passage and facing fear in their lives in Alaska, and it's been incredible, actually. For all the lucrative jobs I've had, that is so much richer than having a great paycheck or whatever, seeing people face the biggest fears they have in their life when it comes to the thing they love most or their activity they love most, snowboarding. And then every single person does that. And it's incredible to be a part of that, So I identify exactly with what you're saying.
Well, I think snowboarding may have brought that to both of us. I maybe this isn't true for you, but for me, when I first looked at snowboarding, I could get what it was because I could skateboard. And I'm like, oh yeah, skateboarding on snow. I get what that might be like. I would love to try that out. And this first time I got on a snowboard, I just fell on my face because it doesn't turn like skateboard trucks.
It's not easy.
Snow is complicated.
Yeah.
And but by the end of that first day of falling down and you're all bruised and you're soaking wet, and anybody who hasn't learned to snowboard yet, you don't have to go through this experience to get to be a snowboarder, but we did.
With bad equipment and and
there are
lack of information, all sorts of challenges.
A lot of things
we had.
that are going for the beginner snowboarder today that weren't going for us then. But when it finally clicked, it was just like walking on water. When I could point to a place on the hill and go, I'm going to ride over there, and then I'm going to turn, and I'm going to ride over here, and I'm going to go over that bump and get a little bit of air. It was like walking on water. And that I've never forgotten that feeling. And that is that sort of overcoming fear or overcoming doubt or challenges.
Right. You just don't know what the outcome is going to be. But when you do find that outcome that's so glorious, it's like you become a new person.
And you can apply it everywhere. And
yeah.
I know I'm probably misquoting her, and maybe it's not even her quote, but I think it was Eleanor Roosevelt that said something like, do something that scares you every day.
Yeah.
And I think that when you grow up skateboarding or surfing or snowboarding, probably like a lot of other sports too, but my life experience is standing sideways on things. there were a lot of things I did that terrified me. Dropping in on a ramp for the first time.
Yeah. Oh man, I sat there with a shaking knee, like 1 foot on the board.
But man, when you finally get it,
yeah,
it just opens your mind to all the possibilities of things you thought you couldn't do before.
And then you also become an expert in like risk management because you're like, let me really think this through before I do this. Let me actually see like what are the negative potential outcomes here too.
Totally.
So and you do that as like a skateboarder, as a 14-year-old kid. You're like learning this stuff that that actually applies to your whole life.
But I can remember it would fall on me at skate camp because I'd have pro skaters there, and the better kids would want to skate with them and learn from them because they were near enough to their level that there was something that they could get from watching them or listening to them. But the never ever kids who their parents had just left them in my care because they said they might like skateboarding, it was on me to spend the time with them to make sure that they had a good week. And I don't know, maybe it was the second or third week of skate camp where I started to learn what the formula was to get these kids to have, a fun time skateboarding and learn something in the process. But I got to the point where I was like, okay, you guys are going to be here for 5 days. By the end of the day tomorrow, you're going to ollie over that 2x4 over there, a 1.5 inch high, 3.5 inch wide block of wood. And I'll bet that sounds impossible to you now. It's going to be easy by tomorrow afternoon. Just watch.
Mm-hmm.
And, I knew enough about the mechanics of ollieing and trying to explain it to other people that I was really confident I could get them all over that little block of wood. And I always did. Cool. And those kids at the end of the week would just be like, thank you, this was amazing.
Right, they're skaters for life.
Yeah,
right.
I still hear from kids at my skate camp probably once or twice a year. Wherever they are in their life, they just hit me up and go, man, I'll never forget the skate camp that you
Well, I think if you combine the experience you had managing people, doing all this stuff with that experience of changing people's lives through life experience, that could be a very dynamic.
That would be a great next 10 years.
That would be. It was a great last 10 years, but it wasn't on a macro level. It was a micro level, you know, but still it's like that.
So what this actually was an incredible career counseling moment for me from you. So thank you.
You know, I'm actually trying to do the opposite. I'm trying to be the sandpaper to rub off you and learn a little bit, you know? I'm trying to pick up the sawdust there.
I feel like you threw down the gauntlet now. I'm like, man, I really need to, like, think about...
Well, if you need any help, I'm volunteer. Let me volunteer, right? Because it's like... yeah, we'll come to Alaska. We'll go ride powder together, and I'll hold your feet to the fire.
Totally. I will do something that scares me every day that I'm in Alaska, for sure.
Oh, yeah. Well, just maybe every day in your life, as you pointed out. Eleanor Roosevelt, she wasn't like, you know, she wasn't known for her, like, jumping out of planes or any of that. But, like, there's little baby steps you can take towards fear, too. Yeah. Right? So.
Well, I mean, there's all kinds of fear, too. Fear of, you know, being judged or... fear of looking stupid, like this.
Yeah.
Like there's so many ways that I think we stifle our own potential and creativity,
right?
Because
you're like looking at the negative outcomes and not the potential positive outcomes. You know, we're not finding a balance between the two. Because certainly you could make like just a huge mistake, like I could run right across the highway, right? That's fearful. I'm scared of that. Bam, right?
Well, this is where it goes back to being that kid on a vert ramp trying to drop in for the first time, where it is just intimidating enough to make you really think it through. Like you're not gonna just drop in casually. You're gonna at least maybe put some knee pads on, maybe because your parents told you to. You got the helmet on, but whatever. You got people standing around you who have done it before and they're trying to coach you through it. And you know already how to fall because you've done other things on a skateboard. So when you hit the flat bottom and you're leaning too far forward or back, you instinctively will land in a way that's not going to send you to the hospital. But you're evaluating the risk as you're taking it.
Yeah.
But hey, with the right context or environment and with the right people there, you can do things that you
Never
Thought
thought.
would be impossible.
Yeah, isn't it crazy?
Sliding down a mountain
Yeah.
on a plank.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like why snowboarding is still relevant to me 30 years plus later. You know, it's still totally relevant. And it's like, I ask myself the question of like, why the heck am I still as fascinated as when I was 14? And why do I think that there's actually more to learn about it? And so I was like, how do I do that? Well, I sit down with guys like you and I pick your brain, and that's how I learned, you know, because I think that like I was so focused on the pros and the cutting edge of the progression of the sport, but really snowboarding is also about progression in life, you know, and facing fears and like learning how to know what you can do and what you can't do, and realizing, you know, I don't know, I'm still going for it.
Well, I think that there's, you know, sports like snowboarding never run out of new things to attempt. And I don't mean necessarily in terms of size of the maneuver or number of rotations. I just, you know, I'm fascinated when I watch kids on just a knee-high rail, you know, at the shallow end of the park. And so there's so many ways to innovate how you move over snow. It never gets boring. And, you know, the mountain's never the same. The snow is never the same. You don't come to the mountain every day as the same person. So you've got just this infinite canvas to work with snowboarding. And I just
it sounds like you're still a snowboarder at
Oh,
heart.
hell yeah. I mean, there's a stack of snowboards here and in Vermont. I don't ride the number of days that I did when I lived in a resort town, but I still get out there. And, you know, I will still go on a shitty day because I remember that sometimes the shittiest days end up being the funnest days. Mm-hmm. And I have not forgotten what it felt like that first time to link turns. And anytime you've ever had to hike out of a gully, you're reminded what an elegant machine a snowboard is. It has no moving parts.
Yeah.
But how many times have you stood at the top of a peak and said, I can get to the bottom in about 12 minutes on this board. If I had to down hike this thing, it could take me all day.
Yeah.
But there's no engine, there's no motor. This thing doesn't hover.
Yeah.
It just glides on top of the snow. It's like magic.
And you know, as good as I think I am, I still make those mistakes where I go down the wrong way and end up and I'm like, wait a minute, the lift isn't open for the year yet over here. How did I get over here?
Well, that's the seduction of powder is you will follow, you know, the slightest gut inkling that there's another stash over there that somebody hasn't got to yet.
Yeah.
And sometimes you pay dearly with the hike out.
Learning lessons. Cool. Well, thank you very much, Dave. I
Thank
appreciate
you.
your time. This has been really fun.
I feel like I really need to think about the next 10 years. So
cool.
Thanks for that.
Let me volunteer to serve in your next 10 years and help you change people's lives, because I know you're going to do some amazing stuff. If the past is any indication of the future, or if like you find out where you're going by where you came from, and certainly the path that you've had, the trajectory that you've led has been pretty fascinating.
Awesome.
So,
thank you.
Thank you.
On behalf of Mark Sullivan and the Beeve, thanks for listening to the Snowboard Project. Remember, ride fast, take chances, dream big, and take action. And for God's sake, don't be a... Don't forget to support advertising-free snowboarding media at patreon.com. The Snowboard Project. The Snowboard Project. The Snowboard Project.